The truck's tires ground against the gravel as they rolled along the winding road through Tennessee's sleepy hills. Emily gazed out the passenger window, her thoughts tangled in the landscape. The air was thick with dust and the scent of pine, far different from the sterile air-conditioned environment of their apartment in Charlotte. Here, the silence was heavy, unnerving. Her husband Mark, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, was humming along to some old country song, his foot lightly tapping the pedal. "Almost there," he said, his voice bright, but lacking the enthusiasm that should have been there for a trip like this. He wasn't the same anymore. Emily only nodded, offering a brief smile that didn't reach her eyes. The truth was, she didn't really want to go. The trip had been Mark's idea, a weekend away from the grind of his tech startup, away from the stress of emails and deadlines, a way to reconnect. But Emily felt disconnected. From Mark. From the life they had built together. It had been like this for months now. Silent dinners. Cold conversations. She was just floating. As they passed through a small town, the sun was beginning its descent behind the distant hills, casting long shadows that stretched across the land. The farm was up ahead. Mark's grandfather, Joe, had invited them to the farm for the first time in ages. He wanted help with the harvest and the farm's machinery, but mostly, it was a way for Mark to escape the constant pressure of his business. He'd said it was time to unplug. Emily wasn't sure she could unplug. Not from what was inside her, not from the nagging thoughts that had grown louder in the last few months. As the truck crested a hill, the farm came into view, a weathered farmhouse with chipped white paint and a sagging porch. To the right, a barn stood proudly, its red exterior faded by the sun. And there, parked in front of the barn, was an old John Deere tractor. It looked as though it had seen more than a few seasons. "Here we are," Mark said, pulling into the gravel driveway. He grinned, excited, as though this was exactly what they needed. Emily couldn't muster that same enthusiasm. She just nodded and got out, the gravel crunching beneath her boots. Joe was standing on the porch waiting for them. He didn't wave or call out. He simply watched as they walked toward him. He was taller than Emily had expected. At 76, he still had the kind of frame that looked as though it had been carved from stone. His weathered face was sharp, his eyes clear blue under the sun-kissed skin. His hands, rough and calloused, were folded across his chest in a way that seemed both welcoming and intimidating. "Mark," he called out, his voice low and gravelly, like the sound of a tractor engine idling in the distance. "Been a long time, boy." Mark smiled and approached him with an outstretched hand. "Good to see you, Grandpa. It's been, 5 years?" Joe gripped his hand firmly, pulling him into a quick hug. "You still look like a city boy." They laughed, the kind of warm, familiar laughter that filled the spaces between people who had known each other forever. Joe's gaze shifted to Emily, standing a little behind Mark, as though uncertain how to approach her. He didn't smile. Didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he simply nodded, as though he'd already sized her up in a single glance. "So, this is the wife." His voice was gruff, but not unkind. Emily stepped forward, extending her hand. "Yes, I'm Emily. Nice to finally meet you." Joe didn't take her hand. Instead, he stepped closer, his eyes scanning her face with an intensity that caught her off guard. He didn't look at her like a grandfather or an old man looking at his grandson's wife. He looked at her like she was something unfamiliar. "You've got a strong face," he said, his voice surprisingly soft, yet firm. "Sharp eyes. You don't look like the kind of woman who gets rattled easy." Emily blinked. Thanks." He gave a brief nod. "I'll get used to you. You're a lot like your husband, just quieter." Mark chuckled nervously, breaking the tension. "Joe, behave yourself. Emily's not used to people who skip pleasantries." Emily couldn't tell if she was uncomfortable or intrigued. Joe wasn't rude, but there was something about his manner that made her feel like she was being observed under a microscope. They made their way inside, and Emily took in the farmhouse's rustic charm. The rooms were small and dimly lit, the furniture old but solid, the walls adorned with black and white photos of a family that had long since moved on. Everything smelled faintly of tobacco, wood, and a life that had been lived slowly, carefully. Emily wandered toward the kitchen, where a pot of something was simmering on the stove. Joe's wife, a woman she hadn't yet met, was in the corner, humming a soft tune as she worked. Joe had mentioned she was too frail to do much anymore. After a brief meal, they sat on the porch, the wind cooling the summer heat. Mark took a deep breath. "This place is amazing, Joe. I can't believe you've kept it going all these years." Joe smiled, but there was a weariness in his eyes. "Ain't much left of it. Land's getting old. So am I. But the tractor still runs, and the barn still stands. That's more than most can say." Emily didn't know what to say to that. She stared out across the field, where the grass swayed gently in the breeze. The world felt bigger out here. More open. The silence was different. Not the quiet of a city street or the hum of an office. This silence was full of possibility. But there was something heavy about it, too. "So, Emily," Joe's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You like it out here?" Emily looked up, finding him watching her intently, his gaze more piercing than she'd expected. She smiled, unsure how to answer. "It's peaceful. I'm just not used to all the space." He nodded slowly, his lips curling into a small smile. "I suppose not. But out here, space is all you've got." That night, after dinner, Emily found herself standing on the porch again, the cool evening air brushing against her skin. The sun had long since dipped behind the horizon, leaving the sky a dusky purple. The stars above were brilliant, untainted by city lights. Mark was inside, chatting with Joe about some old tractor repairs. Emily could hear their low voices from the doorway, but she didn't want to join them. She didn't want to hear about hay balers and broken farm equipment. She didn't want to talk at all as something had changed in her today. Something in the way Joe looked at her, the way his eyes seemed to pierce through the walls she'd built around herself. It was unsettling. And, for the first time in a long while, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was more than just a visitor on this farm. She was being watched. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to find Joe standing just inside the door, his silhouette dark against the warm light of the house. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. Emily stiffened, unsure how to respond. "Yeah. Just thinking." Joe stepped out onto the porch, the old wooden boards creaking under his weight. "Thinking about what?" She shrugged, trying to downplay the unease that had been gnawing at her all evening. "Just the farm, I guess. It's beautiful here. So peaceful." Joe smiled, though there was something that didn't sit quite right with it. "It has its moments," he said, his voice low and almost distant. "But sometimes, silence can be louder than any noise." Emily turned to look at him fully now. He wasn't smiling. His eyes were fixed on her, like a predator sizing up his prey. "Is that so?" she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "You get used to it, I suppose." Joe's eyes never left hers. "Maybe. But some people can't." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. Emily swallowed hard, feeling her throat tighten. She didn't know why, but she suddenly felt like she had to get away from him. The tension in the air was suffocating, and she couldn't put her finger on what was making her so uncomfortable. "Well, I'm going to head inside," she said quickly, her voice a little sharper than she intended. Joe didn't move. He stood there, watching her with that same steady gaze. "Don't go too soon," he said, his tone soft but commanding. "You don't have to rush away. Not everything needs to be done so fast." Emily took a deep breath. There was something about the way he spoke, something almost predatory. It was subtle, but it sent a shiver down her spine. "I'm fine," she said, forcing a smile. "I just want to get some sleep." Joe's expression softened slightly, but his eyes remained locked on hers. "All right, then. Good night, Emily." "Good night, Joe," she replied, turning and heading back into the house. As she passed the doorframe, she caught a glimpse of Mark sitting at the kitchen table, his back to her as he continued talking to Joe. The contrast between the two men couldn't have been more striking. Mark, young and full of ambition, lost in his business plans. Joe, old and weathered, with a quiet power that seemed to radiate from him like the farm itself. Emily's heart rate quickened as she made her way to the guest room. The unsettling tension that had started in the morning seemed to have followed her all day. Something about Joe felt off, but she couldn't put it into words. When she laid down in the bed, the silence of the farm crept in around her, filling every corner of the room. She turned over, trying to find a comfortable position, but her mind was restless. She didn't know how long she lay there before she heard the floorboards creaking outside her door. At first, she thought it was Mark, coming to check on her. But then the sound stopped. There was a knock. Soft, almost imperceptible. Emily froze, her breath catching in her throat. The door creaked open just a fraction. She could barely make out the figure standing there. "Joe. Can I come in?" he asked, his voice low, just above a whisper. Emily's stomach churned. She hadn't expected this. She didn't want this. "Joe, she started, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say. Joe didn't wait for her response. He stepped into the room slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, his voice calm, soothing in a way that only made Emily feel more tense. "I just wanted to talk." Emily sat up in bed, her hands gripping the blanket. She didn't know whether to yell at him, to push him away, or to run, but instead, she just stared at him, feeling a mixture of fear and confusion swirling inside her. Joe took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "I've been watching you, Emily," he said softly. "I know what's inside you." His words sent a chill down her spine. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, barely able to force the words past her lips. Joe smiled, his expression more knowing now. "You think I haven't noticed? The way you move. The way you breathe. The way you look at me." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her body frozen with terror. But before she could finish, he stepped forward again, his hand reaching out toward her. Without thinking, Emily scrambled to the edge of the bed, her pulse racing as she backed away from him. "Please, Joe, don't." But Joe didn't stop. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her arm, cold and deliberate. "You're afraid of what you want, Emily," he whispered. "But I can help you. I know exactly what you need." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "Stop," she cried, finally finding her voice. Joe paused, his hands still hovering in the air between them. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, though his words only made her more terrified. "I'm here to give you what you've been longing for." But Emily was already standing, moving quickly toward the door, desperate to get away from him. "I don't want anything from you," she shouted, her voice shaky with fear and anger. Joe watched her go, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You'll understand soon enough," he said, his tone finally. Emily slammed the door behind her, her heart racing as she backed away from it, sinking to the floor. Her body trembled, her mind spinning with confusion and fear. What the hell had just happened? The morning came too quickly for Emily. She had barely slept, her mind still racing from the events of the previous night. The image of Joe's cold, knowing eyes haunted her, and the memory of his touch sent shivers down her spine. It was as though she could still feel his fingers on her arm, even though she had locked herself in her room after the confrontation. Mark hadn't noticed the tension. He never did. He was too absorbed in his own world, his head full of work and ideas. When he woke up, he was already on the phone, talking to someone from the office about a problem with a client. It wasn't until later that morning, after a brief breakfast, that he suggested they go check on the farm's machinery. "Joe said he needs help with the tractor today," Mark said, his eyes bright with purpose. "It's been acting up, and he wants me to take a look at it." "You coming?" Emily hesitated, the thought of spending more time around Joe making her stomach twist. But she couldn't stay locked in the house forever, and Mark was so excited about the farm life that she didn't want to disappoint him. Besides, maybe getting some fresh air would clear her head. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I'll come." They walked out to the barn, the heavy wooden door creaking as they pushed it open. The barn smelled of hay and oil, and in the dim light, the old John Deere tractor sat waiting. Its green paint had faded over the years, but it still looked like it could run forever. Joe was already there, his hands working on the engine, a grease-streaked rag draped over his shoulder. He looked up as they approached, his eyes scanning Emily for a moment longer than necessary before nodding in acknowledgement. "Morning," he said, his voice low and steady. Morning, Emily replied, trying to keep her tone neutral, though it was hard to ignore the way his gaze seemed to linger on her. Mark immediately moved to the tractor, opening the hood to inspect the engine. Joe followed, offering advice here and there, pointing out the things Mark should check. Emily stood off to the side, unsure of where to position herself. She didn't feel like a part of their conversation. She felt like an outsider. But then Joe spoke again, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You know," he said, turning toward Emily, "this tractor could use a good run. It's been sitting here for a while. You ever driven one of these?" Emily blinked, taken off guard by the question. She had never driven a tractor, not once in her life. But Joe's piercing eyes were on her again, and there was something in his tone that made her uneasy, yet intrigued. I've never driven one," she admitted, glancing at Mark for reassurance. But Mark was too absorbed in the engine, not paying attention. Joe's smile was slow, calculated. "Well, it's not that hard. I can show you. You're not afraid of a little dirt, are you?" Emily wasn't sure why, but she felt like she had no choice but to agree. Maybe it was the way he asked, or maybe it was the strange pull she felt toward him. Whatever it was, she nodded. "Okay, show me." Joe didn't need much encouragement. He immediately climbed onto the tractor, his movements fluid, almost practiced, like he'd done this 1,000 times before. Emily hesitated for a moment, but then followed, pulling herself up onto the seat behind him. The engine rumbled to life beneath them, and Joe's hands gripped the wheel with familiarity, the smell of gasoline filling the air. Emily tried to relax, but the proximity to him made her skin prickle. He was so close, too close. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel, and she could feel the heat of his body next to hers. The tractor jolted forward, and Emily instinctively gripped the metal frame in front of her, her body tense. She tried to focus on the road ahead, but the feeling of Joe's presence beside her was overwhelming. Every time he moved, every time the tractor bounced over the uneven dirt path, she could feel him. It was as if his body were pressing against hers with each movement, the air thick with unspoken tension. "Relax," Joe said suddenly, his voice a low murmur in her ear. "It's just a tractor. You don't need to be so stiff." Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know why, but his proximity, the way his voice seemed to wrap around her, made her feel exposed. Vulnerable. "I'm fine," she said, her voice tighter than she meant it to be. "I'm just not used to this." Joe chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. "You'll get the hang of it. All you need is a little patience." His words lingered in the air, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just talking about the tractor. They rode in silence for a few moments, the sound of the engine roaring in their ears. Emily focused on the landscape around them, trying to ignore the strange tension that simmered between her and Joe. But no matter where she looked, it was there. The way his hand rested casually on the gearshift. The way his body seemed to fill the space next to hers. Suddenly, the tractor hit a bump, and Emily lost her grip on the seat, lurching forward into Joe. The movement was abrupt, and before she could pull back, his arm shot out, steadying her against his chest. "Careful," he murmured, his voice thick with something Emily couldn't quite place. Her breath caught in her throat as she felt the hard press of his body against hers. His chest was solid, his arm around her waist tight, holding her in place. She could feel his breath on her neck, the warmth of his skin seeping into hers. "Sorry," Emily whispered, her heart racing as she quickly pulled away. "I didn't mean to." Joe's hand stayed on her waist a moment longer than necessary before pulling back, his touch lingering in a way that made Emily's skin flush. "No need to apologize," he said softly. "Just keep your balance. You're doing fine." But Emily didn't feel fine. She felt as though the air around them had thickened, heavy with an intensity she couldn't escape. The rest of the ride was a blur, her mind swirling with thoughts, her body still trembling from the brief, unexpected contact. When they finally returned to the barn, Mark was waiting, his brow furrowed as he wiped his hands on a rag. "Everything okay?" he asked, looking at Emily with a slight frown. "Yeah, just a little bumpy," she said, forcing a smile. "I'm fine." Joe didn't speak, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than it should have. Then, he turned and walked away, leaving Emily standing there, her heart still racing in her chest. The day dragged on, the sun climbing higher into the sky as Emily tried to shake off the unsettling tension that had followed her since that tractor ride. Every glance from Joe, every quiet comment, seemed to burrow deeper into her mind, gnawing at her. She couldn't focus, couldn't escape the way his presence seemed to fill every space she entered. Mark, oblivious as always, suggested they go for a walk in the fields that afternoon. He was excited to explore the land, his eyes sparkling with the promise of new business ventures and plans. Emily, on the other hand, felt as if she were suffocating. The weight of her thoughts, the inexplicable pull she felt toward Joe, was too much to ignore. "Come on, Em, it'll be fun," Mark said, his hand on her shoulder as he smiled brightly. "Let's take a look at the crops, maybe get some fresh air. We'll make it a good afternoon." Emily nodded, forcing a smile despite the tightness in her chest. "Sure. Let's go." The walk was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The wide open fields stretched out in every direction, the rows of crops swaying gently in the breeze. It was a place of simplicity, of quiet, and yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking beneath the surface. As they walked, she could feel Joe's presence like a shadow trailing just behind them. It was as though he were always watching, always waiting. "Joe said he'll meet us at the end of the field," Mark said, oblivious to the cloud that hung over Emily. "He wants to show me the fence line. There's a problem with some of the posts. You okay with that?" Emily's heart skipped a beat. The thought of spending more time with Joe, even in the wide open space of the fields, made her stomach twist. She had already felt his gaze burn into her, had already felt his touch linger on her skin. She didn't know how much more she could take. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, her voice flat. She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince Mark or herself. They reached the end of the field, and there, leaning against the fence, stood Joe. He looked up as they approached, his gaze immediately locking with Emily's. His eyes were unreadable, but there was something in them that made her pulse quicken. "Hey, Joe," Mark called, clapping him on the back as they approached. "Let's take a look at the posts. You've got a good eye for this stuff." Joe nodded, but his focus never left Emily. He smiled at Mark, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sure. Just wanted to give Emily a little tour of the property while you look over the fence." Emily's breath caught in her throat. "I'm fine, really," she said quickly, taking a step back. "I don't need a tour." But Joe didn't take no for an answer. "It'll only be a short walk," he said, his voice low and persuasive. "I promise." Mark looked at her, then shrugged. "Go ahead, Em. It'll be nice for you to get out and see the farm." With a final glance at Mark, who seemed completely unfazed, Emily found herself walking alongside Joe, away from the safety of her husband and into the vast openness of the field. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. The only sound was the rustling of the crops in the wind and the steady rhythm of their footsteps on the dirt path. As they walked, Emily could feel Joe's presence beside her, his every movement sending a wave of discomfort through her. His eyes were fixed ahead, but Emily could feel him watching her from the corner of his gaze. He was waiting for something, she could tell. But what? She wasn't sure. Finally, Joe spoke, his voice low and steady. "You know, Emily, there's something about this place. It gets under your skin. It makes you feel things you didn't even know were there." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Joe's smile was slow, deliberate. "I mean that sometimes, when you're out here, you can't help but think about what's real and what's not. About what you want and what you're afraid to admit." Emily swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in her stomach. "I don't know what you're talking about." Joe stopped walking, turning to face her. The air between them seemed to thicken, the space closing in around them. "I think you do," he said softly. "I think you know exactly what I mean." His words sent a shiver down her spine. Emily's pulse raced, her body tense with fear and anticipation. She wanted to step back, to put distance between them, but for some reason, she couldn't move. His presence was overwhelming, like a magnetic force that pulled her in against her will. "Joe," she said, her voice shaking, "please stop." But Joe didn't stop. He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't need to be afraid of me," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. "You don't need to pretend anymore. I can give you what you've been searching for." Emily's breath hitched in her chest, and for a moment, she was frozen. Everything in her screamed at her to run, to push him away, but she couldn't. Not while he was so close. Not while he was looking at her like that. Without warning, Joe reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. His touch was gentle, but there was an unmistakable intensity behind it. Emily stiffened, but she couldn't pull away. "Joe, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't right." But Joe didn't seem to hear her. His hand slid down her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw as he moved closer. "It doesn't have to be right, Emily," he murmured. "It just has to feel real." Suddenly, Emily was snapped back to reality. She could feel the ground beneath her feet, the wind in her hair, the overwhelming sense of wrongness in the air. She had to get away. She pulled back quickly, stepping away from him, her heart pounding in her chest. "I can't do this," she said, her voice firm now. "I can't be here with you." Joe didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching her with those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through her. Emily turned and ran, her legs pumping as she pushed herself forward, away from him. She didn't look back, didn't stop to catch her breath. She just ran. When she finally reached the farmhouse, she collapsed on the porch, her body trembling with a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. What had just happened? What was Joe doing to her? And why couldn't she shake the feeling that something was about to break, something she couldn't control? Emily sat on the porch, her breath ragged, her mind spinning in 1,000 directions. She had run. She had done exactly what she needed to do, but the feeling of Joe's touch still burned against her skin. His eyes, those dark, unreadable eyes, haunted her. They had followed her even after she'd escaped, and now she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing control of something she had once held dear. Mark came out to find her after a while, his face etched with concern. "Em, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emily stood quickly, wiping her hands on her jeans to steady herself. She couldn't look at him, couldn't face the man she had promised to be faithful to. The thought of confessing to him what had happened was overwhelming. She couldn't bear it, not yet. The guilt gnawed at her, but the confusion inside her was stronger. I just needed some air," she said, forcing a smile, though it was weak at best. "Sorry. I didn't mean to worry you." Mark didn't look entirely convinced, but he nodded. "All right. Well, Joe's heading back to the barn to work on some things. Maybe we should go check on him? I'm sure he'd like some help." Emily's heart raced at the thought of being near Joe again. The last thing she wanted was to face him, to feel his eyes on her once more. But Mark was already turning toward the barn, his enthusiasm too strong to ignore. "Okay," she said quietly, falling in step behind him, her heart sinking with every step. She didn't want to go, didn't want to see Joe, but there was no getting around it. They were both here, in this strange, isolated place, and the distance between them all seemed to be narrowing. It was becoming more difficult to hide from the truth. As they entered the barn, Joe was standing near the tractor, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't look at Emily immediately, but she could feel his presence like a weight in the room. His movements were deliberate, controlled, and when he finally looked up, his gaze immediately found hers. "Back already?" Joe's voice was smooth, almost too calm. "I thought you'd be out there a bit longer." Emily swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. "We decided to come back," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark needed some help. Mark walked over to Joe, clapping him on the back as they discussed the work that needed to be done. But Emily couldn't focus on their words. She couldn't focus on anything except the way Joe stood there, looking at her with a subtle, knowing smile that made her skin prickle. "You okay?" Joe asked after a moment, his voice low enough for only her to hear. You looked a little shaken earlier. I'm fine, she said quickly, forcing herself to look him in the eye. She hated the way her voice wavered. Just tired. Joe didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, and for a fleeting moment, Emily could feel the air shift between them. His eyes locked on hers, and she could feel that pull again, the invisible force that seemed to draw her closer despite everything inside her screaming to pull away. Are you sure? He asked, his tone laced with something darker. Because you don't look fine. Before she could respond, Mark called over to them. Hey, you two coming to help with the fence or what? Joe turned away first, the moment broken, but not before Emily saw that smile faint, but knowing on his lips. It made her stomach twist. Something inside her told her that this wasn't just about the farm, about the tractor, or about the work they had come to do. Joe wasn't just playing the role of a helpful farmhand. He was playing a dangerous game, one that was quickly pulling Emily into its depths. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of activity. Mark and Joe worked together on the fence, and Emily found herself drifting between them, lost in her own thoughts. She couldn't focus on the work, couldn't focus on the way Mark tried to explain the intricacies of farming. All she could think about was Joe, his touch, his voice, the way he seemed to slip under her skin without even trying. As the sun began to set, casting a golden hue over the fields, Emily found herself alone again in the barn. Mark had gone to check on some other equipment, leaving her with nothing but her thoughts and the ever-present shadow of Joe. It wasn't long before he appeared, stepping into the barn with quiet ease. Emily could feel her heart race as soon as he entered, but she didn't move. She couldn't. It was as though her body had become paralyzed under his gaze. Joe stopped a few feet away from her, his expression unreadable. Mark's busy with the plow, he said, his voice low, almost too casual. I thought maybe we could talk. I think you've been avoiding me. Emily took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. I'm not avoiding you, she said, her voice steady, though the truth felt like a lie in her mouth. I just don't think we need to talk. Joe took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. We don't need to talk, no, he said, his voice lowering even more. But I think you want to. I think you've been wanting to for a while. Emily shook her head, trying to step back, but there was no escaping him. He was everywhere. His presence, his voice, the way his body seemed to fill the space between them. She couldn't get away from him. I don't, she stopped herself, realizing how weak her words sounded. What was happening to her? Why did she feel like she was being pulled into something she couldn't control? Joe reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. It's okay, he said softly. I won't hurt you. I just want to show you something. I know you feel it, too. Emily's breath hitched in her chest as his fingers lingered on her skin. She couldn't pull away. She didn't know how. All she could do was stand there, frozen, as he slowly stepped even closer. His lips brushed against her ear, his breath hot against her skin. This is real, he whispered. What we've been dancing around, it's real. Before she could say another word, Joe leaned in, his mouth crashing against hers with a force that sent shockwaves through her entire body. It wasn't gentle, it wasn't sweet, it was overwhelming, urgent, like something that had been building for far too long. And in that moment, with his hands on her body and his lips demanding hers, Emily felt the last of her control slip away, the barn felt suffocating. Emily stood frozen, her body caught between desire and guilt, between her own will and the crushing weight of what she knew she had done. Her lips still tingled from Joe's kiss, and her heart raced in a chaotic rhythm that matched the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She wanted to push him away, to tell him everything that was wrong, to shout and scream and demand that he stop. But there was a part of her, the same part that had given in to the kiss, that didn't want him to stop. That part was scared, confused, and utterly consumed by the longing she felt in that moment. And deep down, she hated herself for it. Joe stepped back slightly, his eyes searching hers, and for a brief moment, there was an unsettling silence between them. He didn't say a word, didn't need to. His presence spoke volumes about desire, about power, and about something far more dangerous than she was ready to admit. Emily. Joe's voice was a low whisper, the sound of her name almost a command. His hands still hovered near her, as if he were waiting for her to make the next move. But she couldn't. She couldn't give him that power over her, not again, not like this. Her thoughts spiraled, her mind a whirlpool of confusion. Everything she had believed about herself, about her marriage, about the life she had built, seemed to be shattering before her eyes. And it was all because of this one, forbidden moment. She started, her voice barely audible. She had to say something, had to stop this before it went too far. I can't do this, Joe. Joe's expression faltered, but only for a moment. He took a step back, but his eyes didn't leave hers. Why, he asked, his voice tinged with frustration, though his calm demeanor never cracked. What are you afraid of, Emily? She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm afraid of everything, she whispered. I'm afraid of what I've become. What this thing is between us. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned her back on him, feeling as if the walls of the barn were closing in on her. I'm married, Joe. I love Mark. I can't betray him like this. Joe's voice softened, but it was still edged with a dangerous edge. You already have, Emily. You've already crossed a line. You can't pretend it didn't happen. You can't pretend we didn't feel it. The truth of his words hit her like a slap to the face. He was right. She had crossed a line. But the depth of that realization sent waves of guilt crashing over her. She couldn't look at him anymore, couldn't face the man who had so effortlessly brought out this darker side of her. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being loyal to her husband, but now she was nothing more than a hollow shell, standing in a barn with a man who had ruined everything. Please, Emily said, her voice breaking. Please leave me alone. Joe didn't argue. He didn't push. Instead, he stepped away, giving her the space she so desperately needed. But even as he walked toward the barn door, he turned to face her one last time. Remember this, Emily, he said quietly, his tone filled with something far more sinister than she was prepared to hear. This will follow you. This moment, this feeling, it doesn't go away. It will haunt you, no matter how far you run. And the next time you think about turning away, think about that. And then he was gone, leaving Emily alone in the silence of the barn, her heart pounding in her chest. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breathing. The sun was setting outside, the sky a mix of oranges and purples, but none of it mattered. The beauty of the moment was lost on her. All that mattered now was the crushing weight of what she had done. When she finally found the strength to leave the barn, she walked slowly back to the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. She didn't know how she was going to face Mark. She didn't know how she was going to look him in the eye after everything that had happened. She had betrayed him. She had betrayed herself. Mark was sitting on the porch when she returned, looking up at her with a smile that immediately made her stomach turn. Hey, there you are. What happened? You look like you've been through a storm. Emily opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She felt like she was drowning in her own guilt, unable to confess what had truly happened. The truth felt like a poison, too toxic to speak aloud. I need to tell you something, she finally managed to say, her voice weak. I'd made a terrible mistake, Mark. Mark stood, concern spreading across his face. What are you talking about? You're scaring me, Emily. I've been unfaithful, she whispered, the words feeling like daggers in her throat. I kissed Joe. I kissed him, and I don't know how it happened, but it did, and Before she could finish, Mark's face twisted in disbelief. His eyes went wide, his body stiffening as if struck by a sudden blow. Emily, he said, his voice tight with shock and hurt, why would you do that? Tears filled Emily's eyes as she collapsed into a chair on the porch. I don't know, she sobbed. I don't know what's happening to me. I never meant to hurt you, Mark. But I've already done it, and I don't know how to fix it. Mark stared at her for a long time, the silence between them growing unbearable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the house. the door slammed behind him, leaving Emily alone with her thoughts and the consequences of her actions. She had crossed the line. She had let herself fall into the abyss of temptation, and now there was no going back. The farm, the fields, the tractor, Joe, everything had changed in a single moment. The man she had promised to love had been betrayed, and nothing would ever be the same.